The Nintendo 64 features a number of fondly remembered platforming games, though it wasn't as if they were releasing in a frenzy one after the other. Super Mario 64 held things down at release, but it was another 2 years before audiences met Banjo and Kazooie. Released with early exclusivity for the Nintendo 64, Rayman 2: The Great Escape reached store shelves during the same month as Donkey Kong 64, both taking advantage of the console's down period of platform games before Banjo-Tooie and the fabled Super Mario 128. With Donkey Kong 64 feeling more like a successor to Banjo-Kazooie than Donkey Kong Country, many critics found the gameplay of Rayman 2 much more refreshing than the formulaic collectathon of many Rareware games. The visuals in Rayman were also a force to be reckoned with, even in the face of Rare's experience and expertise witnessed in Donkey Kong 64's large world. Though to be fair, DK64 had to be packaged with its own RAM expansion pack for the N64, while Rayman 2 simply did fantastic work with the default hardware, pushing the console to its limits without RAM upgrades, disk drives, or any other substantial graphical tricks. Rayman 2's art design was inspired by the works of Hayao Miyazaki, Japanese animator and co-founder of Studio Ghibli, as well as American cartoonist Tex Avery, who had a heavy hand in the development of many Warner Bros. And MGM characters, including Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck. The works of these artists served as excellent inspiration for Rayman's growth from his outdated 2D appearance a few years prior. Despite its overshadowed legacy, Rayman 2 was recognized as a universally enjoyable video game, and found even more success in the following months and years as multiple ports were made for Dreamcast and Windows PC, as well as an improved version for PS2. If Mario and Banjo are some of the only characters that come to mind when you think of great N64 platformers, then it may be time to discover what's so great about Rayman 2: The Great Escape. Rayman 2 begins the same way as any good story, with robot pirates. Admiral Razorbeard and his metal armada have ransacked the Glade of Dreams, enslaving a race of magical creatures known as the Teensies, and shattering the planet's core into 1,000 fragments known as Lums. While recovering these fragments in order to regain his powers, Rayman has to collect 4 magical masks that will awaken a powerful creature known as Polokus, who can banish the robot pirates and free any enslaved creatures in the Glade of Dreams. In regard to our protagonist, Rayman feels a lot like Banjo from Banjo-Kazooie, by means of not having too much dialogue, which is in fact spoken in gibberish anyway, so the player doesn't have to care too much about what the character says, but rather what he does. Rayman felt much more like a fleshed out character in this adventure than he did in his first appearance a few years prior. Players can get behind him as a protagonist because he's well-meaning, optimistic, and energetic. We don't have to care about his noble cause or witty antics, and can instead just appreciate him as a cool character that doesn't get in the way of his own game. The player can attack enemies with a short-ranged magic burst, and can lock onto foes in a similar fashion to The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. However, the faster means of attacking and dodging meant that Rayman was able to have uniquely responsive one-on-one fights in a 3D space. This magic attack also ricochets off walls and features a modest amount of aim assist, in order to make up for the lack of accuracy expected from a player and the available controllers in 1999. In or out of combat, Rayman can even throw carried objects into the air to free his hands for fighting, and then catch the same object on its way down. This allowed for more environmental interactions without leaving the player open to damage. The boss fights find interesting new ways to combine movement and combat in a 3D space, ditching what had become the standard platformer format of simply avoiding your enemy long enough to hit it 3 or so times. Rayman 2's tutorial is little more than short blurbs of text over the first few stages. Most developers at this time hadn't really figured out the whole less is more concept in terms of player education, and often repeatedly halted gameplay to force-feed the player more information. Rayman 2 allows access to any tips the player might need in order to understand the game's basic mechanics, but doesn't get in the way of their own practice or application of common gaming knowledge, if they seem to have everything figured out on their own. Some mechanics don't even require text in order to introduce themselves to the player, as represented by Rayman's ability to cling to vine-covered ceilings, which may very well happen to a player accidentally as they try to gather lums in certain early locations. Rayman utilizes a smooth somersault animation in order to maintain momentum through his jump. He can also spin his ears to allow for a slow descent rather than a traditional double jump. Since each level is modestly sized, the necessity doesn't come down to covering distance while jumping, but rather to be more accurate in order to reach more difficult platforms. His hover maneuver can even be cut short in case the player needs to time their landing in accordance with a hazard or moving structure. Much like the gameplay seen in Donkey Kong Country, Rayman will be able to progress through his adventure thanks to the help of a few other supernatural friends of his, who help him traverse obstacles with a whole variety of changes to the way a player explores or moves through this game's world. These other creatures allow for high-speed movement, chaotic action, and lengthy underwater excursions, breaking up the standard platform-to-platform gameplay. This game's version of a hub world may just be a glorified point-to-point map, but it's still well implemented, and unique to Rayman's 3D design, not forcing the concept of a free-roaming hub, and instead presenting stages in whatever order and format Ubisoft decided. Despite the player not having free control of movement on the level select screen, Rayman will still run around, presenting a glimpse into the sort of obstacles, enemies, and environments the player can expect on each stage. This also makes the levels much easier to track down or remember later if the player is going back to collect more lums or try to 100% the game. Unlike most linear platformers, sometimes the player will actually have to travel back to previously completed levels with newly acquired information in order to access a branching path and solve a problem that's keeping them from progressing. The first environment, the Fairy Glade, presents an impressively natural and colorful setting without the overtly cartoony appearance that nearly every other platformer of this era had adopted, including Super Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, and Spyro the Dragon. Obviously, Rayman himself and many of the characters he meets on this journey certainly fall under the cartoonist umbrella, but the avoidance of neon greens, opaque water, and other flat, boring textures created a world that wasn't tiring to look at, even if it were just for jumping between platforms. Usually, aquatic environments or water levels are a sign of impeded movement and aggravated challenges in most games. Rayman 2, on the other hand, has some of, if not the most pleasant underwater environments in this generation of gaming. Rayman's movement is arguably smoother underwater than on land, oddly enough, and the use of negative space filled with translucent water allowed for more lighting and particle effects to take the place of more demanding polygonal structures or complex textures. The opening cutscene is some of the best 3D animation there is to be seen on the Nintendo 64. This game honestly looks more like a GameCube or PS2 game. Most games in 1999 hardly even had characters that blinked, let alone actually moved their mouth in accordance with the game's dialogue. Even Rayman's death and respawn animations are both smooth and impressive, taking advantage of his separate body parts to do something that's unique to Rayman's design, while keeping it simple and quick enough not to interrupt gameplay in the wake of an aggravating defeat. Personally, I cannot get over how ridiculously good this game looks and feels for 1999. The lighting, sound design, smooth gameplay, Rayman 2 felt truly next-gen, and foreshadowed the sorts of adventures that would dominate the gaming market for several years. The only thing keeping it from being as pleasing in a retrospective sense would be the drop in frame rate due to the visual demand. Even so, I still find this game more visually impressive than the majority of Nintendo's own first-party titles for the N64. There's even an impressive late-game stage that features both a giant floating pirate ship that can be driven by the player, as well as a surprisingly early attempt at the sort of rotating gravity we'd see in Super Mario Galaxy almost a decade later. It's a bit rough around the edges in Rayman 2, but considering this was, again, 1999, I don't think anyone was expecting this level of freedom, even if it's only for a brief instance of the game. This honestly feels like one of the most faithful adaptations of the action platformer genre as we knew it in 2 dimensions and would have imagined it in 3. The polished platforming and combat present in Rayman 2 felt equal to what players would have experienced in popular platformers from a few years prior, such as Donkey Kong Country or Super Mario World. Levels are experienced one at a time, though interconnected, unlike Mario and Banjo's 3D adventures, through whatever realms the developers decided to send them to. The player remains in the Glade of Dreams, traversing and exploring it through remarkably precise gameplay that rewards simple forms of exploration and appropriate tests of player skill. That is what's so great about Rayman 2: The Great Escape. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we explored the overlooked quality of Rayman 2. Want to see some bonus content? Maybe support the creation of these videos? If so, check out the What's So Great Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. Links for all of those are in the description. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Bastion, on screen or in the description. And please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.